Welcome. This is a story from a forgotten world, one ruled by giants, storms, and silence. Let it unfold around you. There's nothing to do, and nowhere to be. Just listen, drift, and follow the rhythm of an ancient earth. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Hell Creek floodplain, a massive form stands motionless against the pale sky. The Matriarch Edmontosaurus rises 13 meters from snout to tail tip, her ancient bulk casting a shadow that could shelter a dozen of her descendants. At 43 years old, she has survived longer than any hadrosaur in memory, her scarred hide bearing testament to countless seasons, predators, and the slow accumulation of time itself. Her breathing comes in measured, deliberate rhythm through flared nostrils, each exhalation visible in the cool morning air. The sound is deeper than it once was, a low rumble that emerges from a chest cavity expanded by decades of life. The deep scar that runs along her tail, a memento from a Tyrannosaurus encounter decades past, aches with the persistent throb of ossified tendons grown rigid with age. Where once flexible muscle and sinew allowed graceful movement, calcium deposits now create an armored lattice beneath her skin, each step a careful negotiation between momentum and pain. The injury had occurred during her 20th year, when a young bull Tyrannosaurus, perhaps overeager to prove itself, had attempted an ambitious attack on the herd's flank. The Matriarch still remembers the crushing weight of those jaws, the sensation of bone-shattering pressure as the predator's teeth sought purchase on her tail vertebrae. Only the intervention of her own mother, then the herd's leader, had saved her from becoming carrion. The old Matriarch had charged with the fury of protective rage, her massive bulk and the combined bellowing of the entire herd, forcing the frustrated predator to release its grip and retreat. But the damage was done. The tooth that remained embedded in the bone had become a permanent reminder, and the surrounding tissue had never quite healed properly. Now, as she stands sentinel in the pre-dawn gloom, that ancient wound serves as both burden and barometer. The calcium deposits that have accumulated around the injury site create a stiffness that extends through much of her tail's length, transforming what was once a flexible counterbalance into something more akin to a rigid club. When atmospheric pressure drops before storms, the old injury throbs with particular intensity. When humidity rises, the surrounding muscles cramp and spasm. And on mornings like this, when the air carries the bone-dry promise of another scorching day, the pain serves as a constant reminder of her mortality. The Matriarch's massive head swings slowly eastward, testing the wind with senses honed by half a lifetime of reading the subtle messages carried on air currents. Her broad, duck-like bill parts slightly, revealing the worn edges of a dental battery that has processed countless tons of vegetation. The hundreds of small, diamond-shaped teeth that once formed sharp ridges for cutting tough plant fibers now show the rounded wear of extreme age. Where a younger animal's teeth would slice cleanly through conifer needles and cycad fronds, hers must work harder, grinding and mashing to break down even the softest vegetation. She draws in the dry scents of drought-stressed conifers and the metallic tang of alkaline mud from what were once reliable water sources. Her olfactory chambers, enlarged by age and experience, can detect nuances that would escape younger animals. The familiar richness of moisture that should herald the seasonal rains is absent. Instead, the wind carries only dust and the brittle fragrance of dying vegetation. The sweet, cloying smell of plant sugars concentrating as water evaporates, the sharp chemical signatures of defensive compounds released by stressed trees. There are other scents, too, ones that speak of ecological collapse in progress. The musty odor of fungal decay rises from fallen logs where saprophytic organisms work overtime to break down wood that would normally remain intact for years. The acidic smell of fermenting fruit tells of an unusual abundance of fallen seeds and berries. Trees desperately dropping their reproductive organs in a last attempt at propagation before death. And underneath it all, the faintest trace of carrion, speaking of animals that have already succumbed to the relentless drought. Behind her, spread across nearly a hectare of trampled earth, 237 members of her extended family lie in the restful sprawl of sleep. The number itself represents a triumph of leadership. When she had first assumed dominance 15 years ago, the herd had numbered barely 60 individuals. Through careful guidance, successful migrations, and the accumulated wisdom of avoiding predators and finding food, she had built this assemblage into one of the largest Edmontosaurus congregations in living memory. Juveniles nestle against their mother's flanks, their smaller forms creating warm pockets of security within the protective circle of adults. A 3-year-old male, his adult size still years away, has wedged himself firmly between two massive females, his striped hide barely visible beneath their sheltering bulk. His mother, a robust female in her prime, keeps one eye partially open even in sleep, her maternal instincts never fully at rest. Nearby, an elderly bull, one of the few males the matriarch permits to remain with the herd year-round, sleeps with his great head pillowed on the flank of a younger female, their relationship one of the gentle companionships that sometimes develop between hadrosaurs of advanced age. The soft snores and occasional shifting of massive bodies creates a gentle symphony of contentment. The sound of air moving through dozens of sets of enlarged nasal passages creates a rhythmic whisper that has comforted the matriarch through countless nights. But now the familiar chorus fills her with urgent responsibility, rather than peace. Each breath represents a life dependent upon her decisions, a creature whose survival rests upon her ability to interpret the changing world correctly. As the eastern horizon begins to blush with dawn's approach, the first stirrings ripple through the herd. The initial movement comes, as it almost always does, from the youngest members. A juvenile Edmontosaurus, barely 2 meters long and still bearing the lighter stripes of youth, raises its delicate head and issues a soft, questioning call. The sound is high-pitched and melodious, nothing like the deep, resonant bellows of the adults, but carrying its own perfect clarity. The juvenile's call triggers a cascade of awakening that follows the complex social hierarchies embedded within the herd structure. Adults who are related to the young caller respond first, their own voices joining in a gentle chorus of reassurance. The sound spreads outward in concentric circles, each animal's awakening triggering responses from neighbors and relatives. Within minutes, dozens of great skulls are lifting from the earth, shaking off the lethargy of sleep, beginning the careful process of rising from their resting positions. The mechanics of awakening for a fully grown Edmontosaurus are complex and deliberate. Unlike smaller animals that can spring to their feet in moments, a 4-ton hadrosaur must orchestrate its return to mobility with careful precision. First comes the shifting of weight from flank to belly, a motion that requires considerable core strength and often produces soft grunts of effort. Then the powerful hind limbs must be positioned correctly beneath the body's center of gravity, the 3-toed feet finding purchase on ground that may have been softened by the weight of sleeping giants. The matriarch watches this daily resurrection with eyes that have seen too many seasons. Her left eye, clouded by a cataract that developed 3 years ago, takes in the familiar sight through a veil of milky distortion. The condition doesn't blind her completely, but it has robbed her of the sharp distance vision that once allowed her to spot predators on the horizon. Now she must rely more heavily on her other senses. The acute hearing that can detect the subtle differences between the footfalls of various predator species, the sophisticated olfactory system that can identify individual herd members by scent alone. Her daughter approaches through the dispersing group, and the matriarch's attention focuses with the intensity that only family relationships can command. At 15 years old, and in the prime of her strength, the younger female moves with the fluid confidence the matriarch remembers from her own youth, where the matriarch's gait has become stiff and measured, each step calculated to minimize the stress on failing joints. Her daughter flows across the uneven ground with effortless grace. The younger female's physical condition represents everything the matriarch once was and can never be again. Her hide gleams with the luster of perfect health, unmarked by the scars and calluses that accumulate over decades of survival. Her dental battery, still sharp and efficient, can slice through the toughest vegetation with ease. Her legs, unencumbered by arthritis or old injuries, can carry her at speeds the matriarch can no longer hope to match. Most significantly, her nasal sacs, the inflatable display organs that mark dominance and breeding condition, can expand to full size, creating brilliant displays of color and size that command immediate respect. Their greeting is a brief touching of massive snouts, an exchange of scents that confirms identity and health. The matriarch's bill, worn smooth by decades of feeding, brushes against her daughter's in a gesture that carries the accumulated weight of years of such meetings. But even in this intimate moment, the matriarch senses the tension building beneath her daughter's calm exterior. The younger female's nasal passages flare wider than usual, and there's a subtle stiffness to her posture that speaks of suppressed challenge. The political dynamics within hadrosaur herds are complex and usually subtle, but the current crisis has brought underlying tensions to the surface. The matriarch's leadership, unquestioned for over a decade, now faces the natural challenge that comes when age begins to outweigh experience. Her daughter's growing confidence has not gone unnoticed by other members of the herd, particularly the prime-aged females who form the core of any hadrosaur society. These animals, in their teens and early 20s, represent the demographic that will ultimately determine the herd's future leadership. The crisis that has been building for weeks can no longer be ignored or postponed. The traditional feeding grounds that have sustained the herd through countless generations lie barren, their once lush fern groves reduced to brittle brown stalks that crumble at the slightest touch. The massive tree ferns that once provided abundant foliage now stand like skeletal monuments to better times, their fronds curled and blackened by the relentless sun. Even their underground root systems, normally a reliable source of moisture and nutrients during dry periods, have begun to fail. The conifer stands that provided winter sustenance are dropping needles in great drifts, creating carpets of brown that release clouds of dust with every footstep. The trees themselves stand in various stages of distress, some still clinging to life with scattered patches of green, others already reduced to bare branches reaching towards a pitiless sky. The resin that normally flows from their bark has crystallized into brittle amber tears, too hardened to provide the sticky nutrition that hadrosaurs sometimes rely upon during lean times. Even the deep-rooted cycads that could usually be relied upon during dry periods have begun to wither. These ancient plants, survivors from the deep past, have always served as a drought reserve for the herd. Their tough, waxy fronds could sustain browsing animals even when other vegetation failed. But now even they show signs of capitulation, their characteristic crown of leaves yellowing from the center outward, their thick trunks beginning to show the wrinkled appearance that precedes complete desiccation. As the herd completes its morning awakening ritual, the matriarch conducts her own daily assessment of their collective condition. The signs of nutritional stress that have been accumulating over the past weeks are now impossible to ignore. The juveniles, normally plump with the rapid growth of youth, show the loose skin that indicates weight loss. Their eyes, which should gleam with vibrant health, have taken on the slightly sunken appearance that speaks of chronic dehydration. The adults fare little better. Several of the older females move with the careful gait of animals conserving energy, their usually powerful chewing muscles working overtime to extract nutrition from increasingly poor quality fodder. The rhythmic sound of grinding teeth, normally a comforting background noise during feeding times, has taken on a desperate quality as dozens of dental batteries struggle to process vegetation that would have been rejected as inadequate in better times. Most concerning of all, the matriarch notices changes in the herd's social dynamics that reflect their deteriorating condition. Normally, generous animals have become more possessive of food, occasionally snapping at others who venture too close to a particularly choice morsel. The gentle cooperation that characterizes well-fed hadrosaurs has begun to fray around the edges, replaced by the subtle selfishness that emerges when survival itself is at stake. A new sound intrudes upon their pastoral scene, cutting through the soft murmur of morning conversation like a blade. From the south comes the deep, rumbling call of another hadrosaur herd. But these are not Edmontosaurus voices. The distinctive honking resonates from the broad crests of a passing Parasaurolophus family group, their haunting calls carrying across the landscape with the clarity that only comes from healthy, well-fed animals. The Parasaurolophus calls tell a story that every member of the matriarch's herd can interpret. These are sounds of contentment, of animals that have found adequate food and water. The complex harmonics that emerge from their hollow cranial crests speak of successful feeding grounds far to the east, in territories unknown to the matriarch's traditional knowledge. It's a siren song of survival, beckoning the desperate towards the unknown. The younger female's head snaps towards the sound, with an intensity that speaks volumes about her state of mind. Her own throat sac begins to inflate with the preparation for a response call, the inflatable tissue expanding as air pressure builds within her respiratory system. The message she prepares to send would be one of inquiry, a request for information about the location of the abundant resources that the Parasaurolophus calls suggest. But the matriarch's deeper, more authoritative bellow cuts through the morning air first. The sound emerges from her massive chest cavity with the resonance of absolute authority, of decisions made and routes chosen. The call is complex, layered with meaning that every member of the herd understands instinctively. It speaks of ancient paths and traditional wisdom, of routes tested by generations of successful migrations. The message is clear. They will follow the ancient paths northward to the river valleys where her mother once led them through similar hardships. The matriarch's call also carries undertones that only the most experienced animals can detect, subtle harmonics that speak of memory and precedent. She remembers other droughts, other times when the familiar resources failed and desperate decisions had to be made. In her 20th year, following a volcanic eruption that poisoned much of the local vegetation, her own mother had led the herd along these same northern routes to salvation. The journey had been difficult, marked by the loss of several elderly animals and one unfortunate juvenile, but the majority had survived to see better times. Yet even as her call echoes across the floodplain, the matriarch feels the weight of doubt pressing against her certainty. The world has changed since those early migrations. The climate patterns that once brought reliable seasonal rains have shifted in ways that her experience cannot fully account for. The rivers that carved the northern valleys may have altered their courses, the result of geological processes that operate on timescales beyond even her extended lifetime. The very landscape of her youth exists now only in memory, preserved in neural pathways that have grown fragile with age. The uncertainty gnaws at her with a persistence that matches the ache in her damaged tail. For the first time in her long leadership, she finds herself questioning not just the wisdom of a particular decision, but the very foundation of her authority. Age has brought knowledge, but it has also brought an awareness of how much remains unknown. The traditional routes she remembers may lead to salvation, or they may lead her family into a trap from which none will emerge. As the herd begins its morning feeding ritual, picking through the meager offerings of drought-stressed vegetation, the matriarch notices other subtle signs that speak of ecological systems under extreme stress. The usual abundance of insects that normally cloud the air during feeding times has dwindled to almost nothing. The beetles and flies that typically swarm around disturbed vegetation are largely absent, their populations crashed along with the plant communities they depend upon. Even the soil itself shows signs of distress. What should be rich, dark earth has taken on the pale, compacted appearance of substrate that has been baked beyond its ability to retain moisture or nutrients. The microscopic community of decomposers that normally break down organic matter has largely ceased to function, leaving dead plant material to accumulate in brittle drifts that pose a fire hazard rather than contributing to soil fertility. The discovery that crystallizes their desperate situation comes as the sun reaches its zenith, when the heat becomes almost unbearable, even for animals adapted to the subtropical climate of the late Cretaceous. A small scouting party returns from the western feeding grounds, their approach marked by the dejected posture that speaks of failure even before their calls can be heard. The scouts, 3 young adults chosen for their speed and stamina, approach the main herd with the slow, deliberate movements of animals bearing unwelcome news. Their leader, a 7-year-old female related to the matriarch through her grandmother's lineage, inflates her nasal sacs in the complex pattern that indicates a formal report to the leadership hierarchy. The message they carry sends a shiver of apprehension through the entire herd. The grove of ancient conifers that had served as their backup food source. A reserve carefully managed and visited only during times of extreme need, has been claimed by a massive Triceratops herd. The scouts describe a scene that would be magnificent under other circumstances. Dozens of the 3-horned giants establishing territorial dominance over an area that spans several hectares, their aggressive posturing and impressive head displays making it clear that trespassers will face the full fury of their meter-long facial horns. The Triceratops, apparently refugees from their own drought-stricken territories to the south, have arrived in numbers not seen for decades. Their presence represents not just competition for resources, but an active threat to any hadrosaur foolish enough to challenge their claim. Unlike Edmontosaurus, which relies on flight and group cohesion for defense, Triceratops are walking fortresses equipped with both the weapons and the temperament to stand and fight. Standing at the center of her assembled family, the matriarch feels the weight of leadership settle upon her shoulders like a physical burden. 237 lives depend upon the wisdom accumulated over 4 decades of survival. Each decision she makes will ripple through the herd's hierarchy, affecting not just the immediate survival of her family, but the genetic legacy they carry forward. The knowledge that she may be the last matriarch to lead such a large congregation adds gravity to every choice. Her daughter stands nearby, flanked by other prime-aged females, whose body language conveys readiness to follow, but also an underlying current of doubt about the traditional roots. These animals, born and raised during the matriarch's successful leadership, have never experienced the kind of crisis that tests the fundamental assumptions of hadrosaur society. Their loyalty is real, but it is loyalty that has never been truly tested by failure. The political calculus is complex and subtle. A direct challenge to the matriarch's authority would be both unprecedented and dangerous. Hadrosaur societies depend upon clear hierarchies for their survival, but the younger animals' growing skepticism about the northern route represents a form of passive resistance that could prove equally destabilizing. If confidence in her leadership erodes too far, the herd could fragment into competing factions, each too small to survive the challenges that lie ahead. The matriarch's response comes not in words, but in action. With deliberate ceremony, she begins to inflate the large nasal sacs that frame her skull's prominent circumnarial depressions. The process is slower than it once was, her aging respiratory system requiring more time to build the pressure necessary for a full display. But gradually, the soft tissue balloons outward, creating a vivid display of deep red and orange coloration that speaks of dominance, authority, and the accumulated weight of successful leadership. The sight is both magnificent and somewhat desperate. The colors, whilst still impressive, lack the brilliant intensity of her prime years. The inflation process, once smooth and rapid, now shows the hesitation and effort of age. But the gesture itself carries undeniable power. This is the display that has maintained order through countless crises, the visual symbol of authority that has guided the herd through 15 years of successful survival. Her daughter's response is immediate and challenging. The younger female's own nasal sacs inflate in mirror response, her superior physical condition allowing for a display that surpasses her mother's in both size and brilliance. Where the matriarch's display shows the muted colors of age, her daughter's blazes with the brilliant intensity of prime breeding condition. The contrast is stark and unmistakable. Old guard versus new, experience versus vitality, tradition versus adaptation. For a long moment, mother and daughter face each other across a gap of mere meters that might as well be a geological epoch. The rest of the herd watches in tense silence, understanding instinctively that they are witnessing a moment that will define their future. The outcome of this confrontation will determine not just their immediate route, but the leadership structure that will guide them through whatever challenges lie ahead. But the confrontation ends not in violence, but in reluctant submission. The weight of tradition, the accumulated respect of decades, and perhaps simple filial duty combine to deflate the younger female's challenge. Her nasal sacs return to normal size with visible reluctance, and she steps back with what might be interpreted as a hadrosaur bow. The gesture preserves face for both animals, whilst maintaining the hierarchy essential to herd survival. The decision made, the matriarch leads her herd in the first steps of what will become their final migration together. The movement begins slowly, with the careful coordination that has been refined through countless journeys. The strongest adults take positions at the periphery, their bodies forming a protective barrier around the more vulnerable members. Juveniles are guided to the center of the formation, their mothers maintaining constant contact through gentle nudges and soft vocalizations. They move northward through landscape, increasingly marked by the signs of ecological stress. Dried stream beds scar the earth like ancient wounds, their courses marked by stands of dead vegetation that once thrived in proximity to water. The exposed sediment tells its own story of environmental collapse. Layers of dried algae and bacterial mats that once indicated healthy aquatic ecosystems now lie cracked and lifeless, baking under the merciless sun. The skeletal remains of a young Thescelosaurus lie bleaching in the sun near their path, a grim reminder that they are not the only creatures struggling against the drought's relentless grip. The small ornithopod's bones show no signs of predation. This was death by desiccation, slow and inexorable. The sight serves as a sobering reminder of what awaits those who make the wrong choices in desperate times. As the great herd begins to string out into the traveling formation that has served them through countless migrations, the matriarch takes her traditional position at the front. Her massive footprints will mark the path for all who follow, each step an act of faith in memories that span decades. The responsibility is enormous. A single wrong turn could lead them all into territory where water no longer exists, where the vegetation has failed completely, where only death awaits. Behind her, the soft thunder of 200 pairs of feet creates a rhythm as old as the species itself. The heartbeat of survival, pulsing steadily northward towards an uncertain future. The sound has comforted her through countless migrations, but now it seems to carry an urgency that speaks of time running short. Each footfall represents not just movement through space, but movement through the dwindling resource of time itself. The sun, now well advanced towards its afternoon position, beats down mercilessly upon the migrating herd. In the distance, barely audible above the sound of their movement, comes the haunting call of Dakota Raptor, the pack hunters whose presence adds urgency to their journey. These swift predators, each standing nearly as tall as a juvenile Edmontosaurus, represent a constant threat that will shadow the herd throughout their migration. The matriarch's scarred tail, stiff with age and old injury, will not serve her well if speed becomes necessary. But for now, they move with the measured pace of hope, following ancient pathways towards water that may no longer exist, guided by the memories of a matriarch who carries within her mind the accumulated wisdom of her species. And perhaps its final chapter. Each step takes them further from the familiar into the unknown. Each mile traversed a commitment to a gamble whose odds remain hidden in the uncertain landscape ahead. 3 days into their northward journey, the matriarch's herd encounters the first of many obstacles that will test both her leadership and her aging body. The migration route that lives so clearly in her memory has led them into a shallow valley where a massive congregation of Pachycephalosaurus has gathered for their annual mating rituals. The sight that greets the approaching Edmontosaurus is both spectacular and deeply problematic. Nearly 40 of the dome-headed dinosaurs have claimed the valley floor, their thick skulls gleaming like polished stone in the afternoon light. The males, their cranial domes enlarged to impressive proportions by the testosterone surge of breeding season, engage in elaborate displays of dominance and courtship. Their ritualistic head-butting contests echo across the landscape like the sound of boulders colliding, each impact reverberating through the ground with enough force to be felt through the feet of approaching giants. The matriarch pauses at the valley's rim, her experienced eye taking in the complex social dynamics playing out below. Pachycephalosaurus mating aggregations are notoriously volatile, the normally solitary animals driven to unusual levels of aggression by hormonal imperatives. The males patrol their claimed territories with jerky, aggressive movements, their heads lowered to display the impressive domes that serve as both weapons and advertisements of genetic fitness. Any intrusion into their domain during this critical period could trigger a cascade of violent responses. Her herd spreads out behind her in the traveling formation that has served them well, but the sight of so many potential obstacles ahead creates visible tension throughout their ranks. The juveniles, sensing the adults' unease, press closer to their mother's flanks. Several of the prime-aged females emit low, questioning calls. Not quite challenges to the matriarch's authority, but clear requests for guidance in this unexpected situation. The matriarch's solution demonstrates the accumulated wisdom of decades spent navigating such challenges. Rather than attempting to force passage through the volatile gathering, she begins a wide detour that will take the herd around the valley's western rim. The route adds several kilometers to their journey and requires navigating rougher terrain, but it avoids the potentially catastrophic confrontation that could result from disturbing rutting Pachycephalosaurus. Her daughter, however, views the detour differently. The younger female's body language speaks of frustration and impatience as she watches the lengthy procession begin its circuitous route around the obstacle. Her nasal sacs inflate partially. Not quite a challenge, but clear indication of disagreement. In her prime physical condition, with reflexes sharp and speed uncompromised by age, she sees no reason why the herd couldn't simply charge through the relatively small dome heads, scattering them through sheer size advantage. The philosophical divide between mother and daughter becomes more apparent with each step of the detour. Where the matriarch sees wisdom in avoiding unnecessary risks, her daughter sees excessive caution that wastes precious time and energy. Where experience counsels patience and careful navigation of complex situations, youth argues for direct action and overwhelming force. The tension between these worldviews grows with each obstacle they encounter, each decision that favors safety over speed. As they complete the detour and return to the main migration route, the toll of the extra distance becomes apparent in the herd's condition. Several of the older animals show signs of increased fatigue, their normally steady gait becoming slightly labored. The juveniles, their smaller reserves of energy depleted more quickly, require more frequent rest stops. Most concerning, the matriarch herself feels the strain in her arthritic joints and ossified tendons, each step sending small shocks of pain through her damaged tail. The second day's major challenge arrives with the discovery of what should have been salvation. The traditional water source that has anchored this migration route for generations lies before them, but transformed into something barely recognizable. Where once a reliable spring had bubbled up from underground aquifers, creating a verdant oasis in the surrounding landscape, now only a depression filled with alkaline mud remains. The site is devastating in its implications. This spring had been the cornerstone of the northern route's viability, the guaranteed water source that justified the longer journey through more challenging terrain. Without it, the entire migration strategy becomes questionable. The matriarch stands at the edge of what was once clear, life-giving water, her reflection visible in the mineral-crusted surface of the bitter residue that remains. Other Edmontosaurus have found this desolation before them. The evidence lies scattered around the dried spring, the bones of 3 adults and a juvenile, their skeletons bearing the telltale signs of death by dehydration rather than predation. These animals, presumably from other herds that had made the same desperate journey, had reached the spring only to find it as barren as the territories they had fled. Their final resting place serves as a grim testament to the failure of traditional solutions in unprecedented times. The herd's water situation becomes critical. Several of the more desperate individuals attempt to access the seepage that still occurs at the spring's center, but the liquid they obtain is so loaded with minerals as to be nearly toxic. The bitter taste causes immediate rejection, but not before some animals have consumed enough to cause digestive distress. The matriarch watches helplessly as 2 of her grandchildren suffer through violent intestinal spasms, their bodies attempting to purge the harmful minerals they've ingested. Competition with other desperate animals adds another layer of complexity to their plight. A mature Ankylosaurus, its massive bulk reduced by obvious weight loss, has claimed the immediate area around the spring. The armored dinosaur shows no inclination to yield ground to the much larger hadrosaur herd. its temperament made even more aggressive by its own desperate thirst. The living tank positions itself between the Edmontosaurus and the meager water source, its clubbed tail swishing in clear warning. The standoff illustrates perfectly the breakdown of normal ecological relationships under extreme stress. In better times, the different species would have shared water sources with minimal conflict, each taking what it needed before moving on. But drought reduces all survival strategies to their most primitive forms. The Ankylosaurus, normally a peaceful browser, has become a territorial guardian, willing to fight for every drop of available moisture. The Matriarch's worn dental battery struggles with the tough, drought-stressed vegetation that surrounds the failed spring. Where younger animals can still extract adequate nutrition from the dried grasses and withered shrubs, her aged teeth can barely penetrate the fibrous material. Each mouthful requires extensive chewing, and even then provides minimal sustenance. The energy cost of processing such poor quality food begins to exceed the nutritional benefit, creating a negative spiral that she recognizes with growing alarm. Her daughter observes these struggles with increasing concern. For the first time, the younger female begins to see her mother not as an obstacle to more decisive action, but as a vulnerable individual whose limitations could doom them all. The revelation brings no satisfaction, only a growing sense of responsibility that weighs heavily on her broad shoulders. The political challenge she had been preparing to mount begins to transform into something more complex. Not a simple power struggle, but a question of when and how leadership transition should occur in the face of mounting crisis. Several elderly herd members show signs of severe dehydration that go beyond the general stress affecting the entire group. Their eyes have taken on the sunken appearance that indicates dangerous fluid loss, and their movements have acquired the careful, measured quality of animals conserving every possible resource. The matriarch recognizes the symptoms from previous droughts, but never in such numbers or severity. The current crisis exceeds anything in her accumulated experience. The psychological impact on the herd becomes as significant as the physical challenges. The social bonds that normally hold the group together begin to show signs of strain. As individual survival needs compete with collective welfare. Normally, generous animals become possessive of any food they discover. Minor disputes over access to shade or the choicest bits of available vegetation escalate into more serious confrontations. The gentle hierarchy that characterizes well-fed hadrosaur society gives way to the harsher dynamics of desperate creatures. It is during this period of mounting stress that predators make their presence known. The first Dakota raptor calls echo across the landscape, just as the herd settles for what passes for rest in their deteriorating condition. The haunting vocalizations speak of pack coordination, of intelligent predators recognizing opportunity in the obvious vulnerability of their potential prey. 3 distinct voices can be identified in the calling pattern, suggesting a hunting group of significant size. The sequence that follows tests every assumption about predator-prey relationships in the late Cretaceous ecosystem. The Dakota raptor pack, comprising 3 adults, each standing nearly 2 meters tall at the hip, employs sophisticated hunting tactics that demonstrate their intelligence and social coordination. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the massive hadrosaurs, they begin a campaign of harassment designed to separate vulnerable individuals from the protective mass of the herd. Their target becomes apparent quickly: a yearling Edmontosaurus whose growth has been stunted by the ongoing nutritional stress. Still bearing the striped pattern of youth, but lacking the size that would normally protect a juvenile of its age, the young animal represents the perfect compromise between accessibility and substantial reward. The raptors begin their attack with coordinated movements that speak of extensive experience in pack hunting. The lead Dakota raptor, distinguishable by its larger size and more elaborate plumage display, begins the assault by charging directly at the herd's flank, where the target juvenile has positioned itself. The attack is not intended to succeed immediately, but rather to trigger a panic response that might scatter the defensive formation. As the massive hadrosaurs wheel away from the threat, the other two raptors position themselves to take advantage of any confusion. The Matriarch's response demonstrates both the capabilities and limitations that define her current condition. Despite her age and physical decline, she immediately recognizes the threat and begins moving towards the endangered juvenile. Her massive bulk, still impressive despite the ravages of time, serves as a deterrent to the attacking predators. But her movement is hampered by the stiffness in her damaged tail and the arthritis that has accumulated in her major joints. Her charge, once a terrifying display of multiple tons of motivated dinosaur, now appears labored and predictable. The lead Dakota raptor, rather than immediately retreating as younger predators might, holds its ground long enough to assess her actual speed and agility. What it observes is encouraging from a predator's perspective. An aging giant whose threat display exceeds her actual capabilities. The encounter escalates when the Matriarch's attempt to protect the juvenile brings her into direct contact with the lead raptor. Her massive head swings towards the predator with all the force she can muster, but the movement telegraphs itself through the stiffness of her neck and the careful way she must position her body to avoid aggravating her tail injury. The Dakota raptor, reading these signals with predatorial expertise, times its evasive action perfectly. What follows is a violent ballet of attack and counterattack that highlights the changing dynamics of late Cretaceous ecosystems. The Matriarch's bulk and determination eventually drive off the immediate threat, but not before sustaining injuries that further compromise her condition. A glancing blow from raptor claws opens shallow gashes along her flank, and the violent twisting required to fend off the attack sends spasms of pain through her ossified tail vertebrae. More significantly, the encounter reveals the shifting balance of power within her own herd. It is her daughter who ultimately leads the coordinated defense that drives off the Dakota raptor pack. The younger female's speed and agility, uncompromised by age or injury, allows her to position herself effectively between the predators and their target. Her threat displays carry the full vigor of prime condition, and her actual combat capabilities match her imposing appearance. The successful defense saves the juvenile, but the aftermath creates new tensions within the herd's leadership structure. Several of the prime-aged females who witness the encounter exchange meaningful glances that speak of shifting loyalties. The Matriarch's courage remains unquestioned, but her physical limitations have been exposed in ways that cannot be ignored or forgotten. As night falls over the desolate landscape, the herd settles into the defensive formation that has protected them through countless previous evenings. But the familiar routine cannot disguise the fundamental changes that have occurred. The matriarch takes her traditional position at the center of the protective circle, but her breathing is labored from the day's exertions, and the wounds on her flank serve as visible reminders of her vulnerability. Her daughter positions herself nearby, but the gesture carries new meaning. Where once proximity to the matriarch indicated deference to established authority, now it suggests protective concern for an aging relative whose continued leadership may no longer serve the herd's best interests. The transformation is subtle but unmistakable to animals whose survival depends on reading such social cues accurately. The night sounds that surround them speak of an ecosystem under stress. The normal chorus of nocturnal creatures has been reduced to scattered individual calls, the complex web of predator and prey relationships simplified by drought into stark struggles for survival. In the distance, the mournful bellowing of other hadrosaur herds suggests that the Edmontosaurus are not alone in their desperate search for resources, but it is the silence that proves most ominous. Large areas of what should be active landscape produce no sounds at all, suggesting the complete collapse of local ecosystems. The absence of the familiar night sounds that should accompany healthy wetlands and forests creates an auditory void that emphasizes the magnitude of the environmental crisis they face. As the matriarch lies in the darkness, her body gradually recovering from the day's trials, she contemplates the harsh mathematics of leadership in desperate times. Each decision she makes must balance the immediate survival needs of individuals against the long-term welfare of the herd. Each mile they travel northward represents a commitment to a strategy that may ultimately prove fatal. And each day that passes reduces their reserves of strength and time, making eventual success less likely even if her memories prove accurate. The weight of responsibility that has sustained her through 15 years of successful leadership now threatens to crush her spirit. For the first time since assuming the mantle of matriarch, she faces the possibility that her accumulated wisdom may prove insufficient to the challenges ahead. The traditional knowledge that has served her species for generations may simply be inadequate to navigate the unprecedented crisis they now confront. Yet abandoning the northern route at this point would mean accepting defeat without having tested her deepest memories against reality. Somewhere ahead, perhaps only days away, the river valleys of her youth might still hold the salvation that has drawn them so far from familiar territory. The gamble that began with their departure from the drought-stricken feeding grounds continues with each step, the stakes rising as their condition deteriorates and their options narrow. Her daughter's watchful presence nearby serves as both comfort and reminder of the succession that must eventually occur. Whether that transition happens through orderly generational change or catastrophic failure depends largely on the decisions that will be made in the days ahead. The northern route that represents the matriarch's final test of leadership may also prove to be her legacy, either as the pathway to salvation or as the choice that doomed them all. Dawn breaks on the 5th day of their desperate journey to reveal a landscape that stirs something deep within the matriarch's ancient memory. The rolling hills ahead, carved by geological forces operating across millions of years, match contours etched into her consciousness during her first migration as a juvenile. Her mother had led them through this same terrain 40 years ago, when the world was younger and water still flowed where now only dust remains. The recognition brings both hope and trepidation. These are the geological markers that should herald their approach to the river valleys of her youth, the promised land that has sustained her faith through 5 days of mounting crisis. But the landscape bears scars that speak of fundamental change. Dried tributaries that once fed the main waterway, vegetation patterns altered by decades of shifting climate, familiar rock formations exposed by the retreat of watercourses that should still be flowing. Her massive form moves with renewed purpose despite the accumulated toll of their journey. The wounds inflicted by the Dakota raptor encounter have begun to heal, but they serve as permanent reminders of her vulnerability. Her dental battery, worn beyond optimal function, struggles with each mouthful of the increasingly poor vegetation they encounter. Blood seeps from her gums, where the grinding surfaces of her teeth have abraded the soft tissue, creating a metallic taste that accompanies every attempt at nourishment. Yet the familiar contours of the approaching terrain awaken memories so vivid they transcend mere recollection. She remembers following her own mother's massive footprints through this same canyon, a juvenile barely 3 meters long, struggling to keep pace with the adults whose strides were twice her own. The terror and excitement of that first great migration return with startling clarity. The sense of venturing into unknown territory, the faith required to follow ancient wisdom into uncertainty. The herd's condition has deteriorated markedly during their northward odyssey. What began as a cohesive social unit of 237 individuals has become a raggedly desperate assembly of creatures, held together more by mutual dependency than by the traditional bonds of hadrosaur society. The juveniles, their growth stunted by malnutrition, move with the careful gait of animals conserving every calorie. Several of the eldest members lag behind the main group, their movements so labored that keeping pace requires constant effort. Most concerning of all, the social fabric that has defined their existence for generations shows signs of fundamental breakdown. Disputes over access to the minimal food resources they encounter escalate into serious confrontations. The gentle hierarchy that once regulated feeding order and resting positions has given way to a more desperate dynamic, where physical strength and proximity to resources determine access to survival necessities. The matriarch's daughter has assumed an increasingly prominent role in maintaining what order remains. Her physical condition, though diminished by the journey's hardships, still surpasses that of most other herd members. More significantly, her leadership during the Dakota raptor encounter has earned her respect that transcends the traditional deference owed to the matriarch's lineage. The younger female's authority now derives from demonstrated capability rather than inherited position. The philosophical tension between traditional wisdom and adaptive leadership reaches its crescendo as they approach the canyon that should lead to salvation. The matriarch's memories insist that water lies beyond the rocky narrows ahead, but her daughter's pragmatic assessment of their deteriorating condition argues for exploring alternative routes whilst they still possess the strength to change direction. It is then, as doubt threatens to overwhelm even the matriarch's iron determination, that they crest the final ridge and witness the sight that validates 40 years of accumulated memory. Below them, carved into the ancient bedrock by countless seasons of flow, stretches a river valley that matches every detail preserved in her recollection. The waterway itself, though diminished by the same drought that has devastated their homeland, still flows with enough volume to represent salvation for their desperate herd. The discovery triggers a transformation throughout the assembled animals. Vocalizations of joy and relief erupt from hundreds of throats as the sight of flowing water rekindles hope that had nearly died during their arduous journey. The Matriarch's leadership, questioned by doubt and undermined by physical decline, suddenly appears vindicated by the evidence spread before them. The ancient knowledge she has carried through 4 decades of existence has led them to exactly what they needed most. But even as jubilation spreads through the herd, the Matriarch's experienced eye detects troubling changes in the river's character. The waterway that flows below them bears only superficial resemblance to the gentle stream she remembers from her youth. Decades of erosion have carved the channel deeper and narrower, concentrating the reduced flow into a swift current that presents challenges unknown to previous generations. The crossing point her mother had used, a broad, shallow ford where the entire herd could wade across with minimal risk, no longer exists. In its place, steep banks confine a waterway that, whilst still passable, demands careful planning and coordination to navigate safely. The margin for error that had characterized the traditional crossing has been eliminated by geological and climatic changes operating on timescales beyond any individual's experience. Nevertheless, the sight of flowing water overcomes such tactical concerns in the minds of most herd members. Several of the more desperate individuals begin making their way down the steep slopes towards the riverbank, their movements betraying the desperate thirst that has driven them beyond the normal constraints of herd discipline. The Matriarch recognizes the dangerous potential for panic and stampede that could result from uncontrolled access to the water they have sought so desperately. Her response draws upon every reserve of authority and experience she still possesses. Moving with painful but determined purpose, she positions herself at the head of the descent route, her massive bulk serving as both obstacle and guidance for the animals following behind. The message her presence conveys is clear. Access to the water will be orderly and controlled, following the disciplined approach that has ensured their survival through countless previous challenges. The Matriarch enters the river first, her enormous feet testing the current and substrate with the caution of age and experience. The water, though reduced from the floods of her memory, still possesses enough force to require careful navigation. Her first steps reveal that the crossing will demand all of her remaining strength and coordination. The current tugs at her legs with insistent pressure, whilst the rocky bottom provides treacherous footing for hooves designed for terrestrial rather than aquatic locomotion. Her technique demonstrates the accumulated wisdom of decades spent leading river crossings. She positions her body at an angle to the current, using her massive bulk to create a zone of reduced water flow behind her. Her damaged tail, despite its stiffness, serves as a rudder to maintain stability against the water's pressure. Most importantly, she chooses a route that maximizes safety for the smaller animals who will follow in her wake. Halfway across the river, she guides the first group of followers, mothers with juveniles who require the protection of her presence and the reduced current her body creates. The crossing proceeds methodically, each animal following precisely in the footsteps of those who preceded them. The matriarch's positioning creates a corridor of relative safety that allows even the smallest herd members to navigate the challenging current. But the exertion required for such careful positioning exceeds the reserves of strength that age and hardship have left her. The constant struggle against the current, combined with the need to maintain stability for the animals depending on her guidance, pushes her arthritic joints and damaged tail beyond their limits. Each step becomes a conscious victory over pain and fatigue, each successful crossing by her followers a triumph that costs her increasingly precious energy. It is as she turns to assist a juvenile that has been swept slightly downstream that the crisis reaches its decisive moment. The young animal, barely a year old and weakened by the journey's hardships, loses its footing on the slippery rocks and begins to tumble towards deeper water where the current runs strongest. Without hesitation, the matriarch abandons her carefully maintained position and launches herself towards the struggling youngster. Her intervention succeeds in its immediate purpose. Her massive bulk intercepts the juvenile's drift, creating a living breakwater that allows the young animal to regain its footing and scramble to safety on the far shore. But the violent effort required for such a rescue, combined with the abandonment of her stable crossing position, drives the matriarch herself into deeper water where her age and injuries become fatal liabilities. The current that she had successfully navigated through careful positioning and gradual progress now seizes her with the full force of flowing water acting upon her enormous mass. Her damaged tail, weakened by decades of accumulated injury and the recent strain of the journey, cannot provide the control and stability that proper river crossing demands. The arthritis that has progressively compromised her joints robs her of the quick responses needed to maintain balance in flowing water. Most critically, the exhaustion that has accumulated through 5 days of desperate leadership leaves her without the reserves of strength necessary for the explosive effort that might still carry her to safety. The muscles that once powered charges capable of driving off predators twice her weight now respond sluggishly to demands that exceed their diminished capabilities. Her daughter, witnessing the crisis from the riverbank where she had been organizing the crossing's second phase, immediately recognizes both the danger and the futility of attempting a rescue. The swift current and treacherous footing that threaten the matriarch would pose equal hazards to any animal attempting to reach her. More importantly, the daughter's own leadership responsibilities to the remaining herd members prohibit the risk of losing both leaders to the same crisis. The eye contact that passes between mother and daughter across the rushing water carries the weight of a lifetime's relationship compressed into a single moment of understanding. The matriarch's gaze conveys not desperation or plea for rescue, but acceptance of the sacrifice that leadership sometimes demands. Her daughter's responding look acknowledges both the loss and the responsibility that must immediately transfer to surviving leadership. With the authority that comes from demonstrated competence and unavoidable necessity, the daughter takes command of the remaining crossing operation. Her calls rally the herd members still on the departure shore, organizing them into the formation necessary for safe passage. The crossing point she selects, based on her own assessment of current conditions rather than inherited memory, proves better suited to the river's changed character. Under her guidance, the remaining members of the herd complete their crossing with methodical efficiency. The younger female's leadership style, though lacking the accumulated wisdom of her predecessor, compensates with adaptability and realistic assessment of present conditions. The philosophical choice between traditional knowledge and innovative adaptation resolves decisively in favor of the approach that ensures survival for the maximum number of individuals. The matriarch, meanwhile, finds herself carried inexorably downstream towards a fate that, whilst tragic, carries its own form of completion. The current deposits her massive form in a quiet eddy where the water's force diminishes and the sandy bottom provides a final resting place. Her breathing becomes labored, then sporadic, as the accumulated stresses of age, injury, and exhaustion combine to overwhelm even her remarkable constitution. Her final hours pass in relative peace, surrounded by the sound of flowing water and the distant calls of her successfully crossed family. The pain that has been her constant companion through recent weeks gradually fades, replaced by a profound exhaustion that makes movement impossible but does not cause suffering. The river that claimed her life also provides the gentle environment for her death. As night settles over the valley, the herd completes its establishment in the northern feeding grounds that the matriarch's memories had promised. The vegetation, whilst still stressed by drought, provides adequate nutrition for their reduced numbers. Most importantly, the flowing river ensures the water supply that will sustain them through whatever challenges lie ahead. The journey that cost their leader's life has achieved its essential purpose. The daughter, now matriarch in fact as well as necessity, stands at the river's edge in the darkness. Her calls carry across the water towards the place where her mother's body has come to rest, vocalizations that serve as both farewell and acknowledgement of the successful conclusion to a desperately dangerous gamble. The traditional knowledge that guided their migration has proved correct in its essential promise, even as the means of its fulfillment demanded the ultimate sacrifice from its guardian. Hours later, a sudden storm system born from the climate chaos affecting the entire region sweeps through the valley. The flash flooding it brings carries volcanic ash and sediment from distant uplands, creating the conditions that will preserve the matriarch's remains for millions of years. Her body, already partially desiccated by the day's heat, becomes buried in the fine sediments that will eventually fossilize every detail of her anatomy. The story of her final migration, the triumph of ancient wisdom balanced against the cost of individual sacrifice, will be written in stone and discovered by creatures not yet evolved. Her fossilized form will eventually tell future scientists about the behavior, ecology, and heroic struggles of one of Earth's most successful herbivorous species during the final chapter of the dinosaur age. But in the immediate aftermath of her death, the herd she led to safety continues the business of survival in the water-rich northern valleys. Under their new matriarch's guidance, they will prosper until the greater catastrophe that ended the age of dinosaurs sweeps away their entire world. The individual sacrifice that saved 236 lives becomes part of the larger tragedy that claimed all non-avian dinosaurs, but also part of the evolutionary legacy that continues in the birds that inherited their ancient heritage. The river continues its eternal flow, carrying nutrients from the matriarch's resting place downstream to to nourish ecosystems she never knew existed, ensuring that even in death, she contributes to the complex web of life that her leadership preserved for one final season.